This video is going to go over how to use the new Project Indexer application. Now this application is only going to be delivered within our Connect Edition workspaces. So if you're working on a project that is utilizing a V8i standard, then this is not the application that you want to use, and you'll want to use the older Project Indexer application. So before we get into the application, I want to give some background on why this application exists. And so it exists mainly to create a zip file of all the project files. That that includes the DGN files, Excel files, maybe some engineering data, and it's the reason why you need to create the zip file is it is part of the requirements of submitting electronic data, which I'll go over in a little bit. So we're going to take this zip file, we're going to use it for two main things. One is to provide it to bidders as a reference only, so they can use these files to help create maybe some models, but it is a reference only. And then secondly, so that if you are working on this project outside of ODOT's data source, that ODOT has a way to receive that data and pull it into our data source for future reference. To launch this application, you can do that from within a Connect Edition project with our standards loaded, if by going to the Ohio DOT workflow, the apps tab, the projects section, and right here the OHDOTCEv02 project indexer. You can also launch this directly from within our standards or workspace. Because this is a standalone product, you do not need the DGN file open to use it. So you can find it in our standards by going to our workspace folder, then standards, applications, and then you can launch this application directly from here. So let's start this application up. And this is what it's going to look like when you first open it. Now, there is a help menu just like pretty much all of our apps. You can see the version by clicking on the About, and then the wiki page link right here will launch our wiki page with some more information like a help doc to go over what all the buttons do within the application. It's a great reference. And then the video that you're watching now will be here. So one thing I want to mention that I did kind of allude to earlier is that we do have electronic deliverables guideline, and here's a link to that document. And it's going to go over kind of what is required to submit in the zip file. So you want to make sure you give this a look over. You're going to need to submit things like the CAD files, alignment files, surface files, engineering data. So make sure you give this a look over because it will go over in more detail kind of what you need to include in the zip file. So now back to the application. The first thing you're going to do is select the PID folder or the work set folder that you want to create a zip file for. So you're going to hit the search button, and it is integrated ProjectWise. So if you have your project inside ProjectWise, you can log into the data source and find it. And so if you have Explorer installed, you will see this dialog. You can hit cancel, and it will then jump over to just a regular Windows folder select dialog. All right, so I'm going to log into ProjectWise, just our testing data source, and I'm going to select an example project where I just threw some dummy files in there for this presentation. So I will go and select that. And what it's going to do is it's going to validate the folder structure of this project. And if it doesn't have the required folders, it's not going to let you select it, and you'll see an error message down here at the bottom. So the bottom is where the log is, so you can expand that log out, and you can further use this dragger to make the section bigger if desired. And it's going to have the details about pretty much all the things that happened while you've been using this application. They will be color-coded: green for if it's a successful process, red if something went wrong, and orange if there's a warning. So even if you have it collapsed, the red or orange messages will appear here, so you kind of can tell that something went wrong. All right, so moving on, after it validates the PID folder that you select, it's going to try to pull the PID number from this folder. And if it can't, then it just puts a -1. So obviously zeros aren't a PID folder, so I put a -1. So if that happens to you, or you don't have the PID in the name, then you can just key it in. So I'll just key in a random one here. See if I get one that's a valid one. And so what's going to do is it's going to go out to the internet and actually try to figure out if that PID exists in our system, and it'll pull in the name of that project as well as the main county. So if it doesn't, it's not a big deal. You just have to fill in the main county. The PID and county will be used when generating the zip file for the name, and then also when it gets to ODOT, we're going to be using that to know where to pull that data into.
One thing I forgot to mention is once you log into a data source, you'll see that this logout of data source button will appear, as well as it's going to tell you what data source you're logged into. So if you ever need to switch to logging into a different data source, maybe you logged into the wrong one, you can just hit the logout button, and then when you hit any of these search buttons, you'll get prompted to log in again.
After that, you move on to the main section of the application. So there's 4 tabs here, and you just kind of work from left to right. So the first tab is going to list all the root subfolders. So that would be all the folders directly inside this PID folder that you selected. And so this is mainly to speed up processing. So only check on the folders that contain files that you want to include in this zip. So if you don't have anything in the planning folder, there's no need to check it on, and then the application won't even look at that folder. So by default, the survey engineering folders will be checked on, as well as the 990 works at standards, and you cannot check off the 990 works at standards. That's always going to be required when you're using this application to pull in those standard files. What you're going to do is just check on all of the root subfolders that have files that you want to include in the zip file, and then you can hit process select folders, and then it'll go through and start reading all of the files within the selected folders. Now, I'll come back to this later, but there is an option to update an existing index. So if you already started one and you came back, you can do that as well, which we'll go over later. So for right now, I'm going to hit process selected folders so it can go through and search those selected root subfolders. So once it's complete, you see that the log section is showing a green message saying that the process has been complete and was successful. So now we moved on to the second tab, which is the file selection tab. So this is where you're actually going to choose what files you want to include in your zip file. So by default, the survey and engineering folders will be checked on, just like in the root subfolder, as well as the 990 workset standards folder. And you'll notice you also cannot uncheck the 990 workset standards folder. And it's showing you the number of files that it found within the folder. So if you expand out, you can see further that the drainage folder has 5, geotech has 0, and so on. And so you can keep expanding out and you can take a look at what those files are. Now, in terms of selecting, if you unselect a folder, it will deselect everything underneath that. So if you don't want to include all 25 files, maybe you only want to include these drainage ones, you can do that. And then you can further come in here, maybe check off, I don't want to include those 2 files. But just note that if you check on or off a folder, everything within it gets applied. So if I were to check this back on, it's going to check those files that I just unselected back on. Hopefully pretty simple to understand. What you're going to do is just go through and check on all the files you want to include, and any files that you don't want to include, maybe they're junk files or whatnot, make sure you uncheck those because there's no reason just to include those in the zip file, right? So once you're done with that, you're going to hit update index with selected files. And so what this is going to do is it's going to actually generate an Excel file, and it's going to place all this data on this file. So let's go through what is in this Excel file now. So there's 2 main tabs. There's the files and the folders owners, and we'll go over the folder owners in a second. But the files worksheet is going to list all those files that you had checked on. It's going to list a couple different data about it. So it's going to list the relative path. So from within the folder you selected, the PID folder, you'll see that relative path to that file. You're going to see category and discipline, and that's really just the root subfolder and then the subfolder right under that, so the top 2 subfolders. Really here just to help maybe do filtering to help you filter out and find files a little bit easier. It's going to list the file name. It's going to list the file extension. Again, help with filtering capabilities here. Now the type is something that it's going to try to figure out automatically. So we've defined a set I guess, number of types here. So there's unknown, there's if it's a base map, a sheet, engineering data, survey data, base map, field book. So this would be like the survey field book file. The surveyor report, if it's an alignment XML, if it's a surface XML, miscellaneous is a catch-all, and then if it's just like a general XML file. So the application will try to figure out the type based off of where it's at and what type of file it is. But it's not foolproof, so you do want to give it a quick check over and make sure everything got set correctly. The next thing it'll grab would be the description. So if you're inside ProjectWise, this is going to be the ProjectWise document description. If you're outside of ProjectWise, it's going to just pull the title and comments and combine them together and list them here. Now here you can, by all means, you'll want to update the description as needed to further describe what this file is. Keep in mind this index is what end user is going to be using to figure out what's in this zip file. So if they're trying to find something, they're going to want to look at the zip file. So the better descriptions, the easier it's going to be for everyone to find that file they're looking for. So feel free to update these as needed. Now the XML comments are only going to be for land XML files. So you can see that we have a couple in here, and it's just going to read that XML file and then pull in, if it's a surface, it's going to pull in the surface name. If it's an alignment, it's going to pull in the alignment name as well as profile names. And that's also how it's figure out if it's what type it should be as well by reading those files. Now, the next column, let me scoot over here, is the file title and comments. So it's going to pull in those file title and comments properties. Now, if you're inside ProjectWise, it will pull in that, but as you can see, mine are not getting pulled in, and that is because the service that runs on this data source to actually populate the title and comments fields from the file is not running on this test data source. So normally it is running, and so if you see it in ProjectWise, then you'll see it in this index file. Now next we'll go over these in a little bit, but this can pull data from the dgen files. So let's jump back to the application now and go over the next tab. So the next tab is going to be the root subfolder owners. So out of the root folders that you selected in the first step here, they should all be listed here as long as you included a file that was within that in the index file. And so what this is geared towards is defining who did the work in that folder. So the main reason why we need this information is for when we import it into our data source, we need to kind of know how to name these folders. So you're just going to fill out the name of the owner, so like your company name. So there's two columns. There's a full name and a short name. So you're just going to fill them out like this. So it might be easier just to copy and paste for these other ones, and then the short name is going to be like some kind of abbreviation that you guys use for your company, because the short name is what we're going to use to append to the folder name when we bring it into our data source. So for this one, I can do the full name of HDR and then HDR. Now, we recommend that you try to get some consistency here, so that you're using this short name the same across all your projects, as well as don't use spaces and don't use special characters as kind of a best practice. So when you hit this update button, all it's going to do is it's going to add that data to the Excel sheet. So if I come back over to here and I go look at the folder owners, now you see they're listed in this tab. So that's all that tab is doing. Now we're on the last tab, and so this will be the index file processing. So if you have dgen files that you included on your index file, then it will show up this drop down listing all of the installed Connect Edition products that you have. And so this is going to be used as the application to process these dgen files to pull in some more data, which I alluded to earlier when I was going over the columns in the index Excel file. So you're just going to want to choose what application you want to use to process the data, or the dgen files rather, and then you can hit this populate update dgen info. Now if you don't have any dgen files listed, then you won't see these two. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this button, and you can watch. It's if you're inside ProjectWise, you're going to see like a manage workspace copy out dialog, but if you're outside, you shouldn't see anything. So there's that. So it's gonna basically open up the dgen files in the background, and it's gonna try to pull a bunch of data that it can. Okay, and when it's done, you'll see there's a green message. Updated dgen info on Excel index file successfully. So if we take a look at our index file now, we go back to the Files tab, you're going to see that these columns are now filled out. So the page number is going to pull the page number from that dgen file. So obviously only the sheets that have the borders, it's going to pull in those page numbers. And if your file has more than one sheet on it, it's going to pull in the lowest and the highest number. So you can see there's two listed here. Same thing goes for subnumbering, if there are subnumbering. And then it will also pull in the sheet title, so it'll just concatenate the sheet title versus the subtitle and subtitle 2 all into one line. And then if you have more than one sheet, then it'll just put this little symbol here to separate so you can see what each of those sheet titles are. So that's more of just sheet data, so you're only going to see that on the sheet files. Now the last two columns are pretty nice. The first column is going to be the missing references, so it's going to tell you the number of missing references that are in that dgen file. So what that means is that the dgen file contains a valid reference, but that reference file is not included in this index. So if I hover over, say this one, it's going to tell me, that this is missing some data here, right? So in this file, a reference in the model is not included, right? So if I edit that note, you can make this a little bit longer to help read it, right? So basically this reference is not included in this model in the file. Okay. Now the broken references are going to show you if there's any broken references in the file. So red references, when you open that dgen, is going to give you that number. So if I look down here, there's some broken ones. So it's saying, hey, you know, this this model in this file contains a broken reference. Um, Now, if you see a -1, that means that the dgen file wasn't processed. So something went wrong there. Along with that, all of the reference information is actually being stored inside this Excel file. So we can use that when we import it. So that's what that is doing. It's giving some little extra data. Now, granted, we really don't want to see numbers here. We want to see zeros. But it doesn't have to be like perfect, but it's a nice little indicator that says, hey, I forgot to include this file in my index. So now let's jump back over to the application, and the last step is going to be to actually create the zip file. So that's this button right here. So we can hit that button. It's going to read in everything on the zip file or on the index file. So anything you have listed here, it's going to try to zip up. And if you added a file manually and it can't find it, it's going to tell you that in the results. And so one thing I forgot to mention is throughout this whole application, even when you're updating the owners or you're doing the file selection, if you made changes to the Excel file, you're not going to lose those. So it's always rereading the data in when it starts the process. So if you did say change the description, it's going to read that in, right? Or if you add a file manually, then when you zip it up, it's going to read in that data again. So don't be afraid of that or it overwriting data. It's not going to do that. So now let's hit this, and it's going to basically say, hey, wait a second. Your Excel file is still open in memory. You need to save it in order to create a zip file. So let's go and do that. So I'm going to go back to this file, and I'm just going to save it uh, just to my desktop for this demo. So the name, it should be your county PID, whatever those are, and then project indexer, right? That should be the name. So I'll save that, and now that that has been saved, I should be able to create the zip file. So now it says, okay, you saved the file, good job. Now where do you want to save this zip file? So you're most likely going to put it, within your project. Be a good spot to put it. So I want to go into my project here, and maybe I just put it in the reference files folder. So it's going to go through and create that zip file now. So once it's complete, you'll see there's a green message. Now if any of the files failed to add to the zip file, it'll tell you that here, and then you can expand it to see more details about which file so it wasn't added. So if we go take a look, we should see that there now, along with some other ones. So there is that zip file. And that is how you use the application. Next, I'll go over how to update an existing one. So if I come back to my root folder selection, as I said, I'd come back later and show this. So if you already have an index file and you need to come back and update it, you can check on update existing index. This gets grayed out until you actually tell me where that file is. So you just hit the search button and you can go and select your index file. Now I just saved it to the desktop right here, and now I can reprocess that data. So what this is going to do is, say I check this off, it's going to read that index file, and if it sees a root subfolder is in the index file that is not checked on, it's going to check that on to make sure that it gets included in the file selection process. So there you see that it checked that back on for me. Other than that, everything else is the same. It's going to open. So if I check all these on and I hit next, it's going to open that Excel file if it's not open, rather than creating one in memory. And then it's going to read in that data from the Excel file, like I mentioned earlier. So it's not going to overwrite any data. So if you change the description, it's going to read that in. If you listed the owners, it's going to read that in. And then lastly, let's just take a quick look at this zip file. So I wanted to mention that the index file gets included automatically. You notice it fixes the name of it as well. And then it also puts a disclaimer in here as well. Just a little text file that talks about that it's general purposes for reference only. So you don't need to include the index Excel file, you don't need to list that in the actual Excel file. Okay, you don't need to do that. Um, it'll know to include it automatically and put it at the root here, because when a person gets into it and they look in the zip file, they're going to want this at the root to know that there is an index file, and they can open that to figure out what is inside the zip file.